The night Caleb finally understood grief, it wasn't at a funeral, it was at a dinner party, watching an entire table of comfortable people discover that the woman they'd been avoiding for 2 years was the bravest person any of them knew. Caleb Turner was 44, a restoration carpenter who spent his days putting 100-year-old houses back together and his nights not thinking too hard about why his own felt so quiet. His wife, Anna, had died 3 years earlier, 11 months after a doctor said the word pancreatic in a small room with bad lighting. Caleb had survived it the way men of his kind survive things, by sanding, sawing, showing, and answering "I'm doing all right" in a tone that closed the topic. He wasn't bitter, he was just folded up, the way you fold a flag, careful and final. The invitation came from Patricia and Glenn Mercer, whose 1920s craftsman Caleb had spent the spring restoring, and Patricia was the sort of hostess who treated her dinner table like a chessboard and the people in her life as pieces that needed arrangement. Just a small dinner, Caleb, 8 people. Casual, nothing involving Patricia and place cards was casual, but the Mercers were good people under the polish, and Caleb had run out of polite refusals sometime in year 2, so on a cool evening in late September he put on his one decent gray sweater and drove over with a bottle of wine he'd asked the store clerk to choose. The Mercers' backyard smelled like the end of summer, cut grass and charcoal smoke, string lights sagging warm and yellow between the maples, a long table set on the patio with cloth napkins and small bowls of olives nobody would finish. There were the Mercers, an orthodontist named Doug and his wife Sherry, a younger couple from Glenn's office, and one empty chair, directly across from the one Patricia steered Caleb into with both hands on his shoulders like she was docking a boat. Caleb looked at the empty chair, then at Patricia, and Patricia smiled the smile of a woman whose plan was already in motion. "Maggie's running a few minutes late," she said. "You'll like her." Doug leaned over before Caleb's beer was even open. "Maggie Holt?" he said to Patricia, eyebrow. "You invited Maggie?" And Sherry made a small sound, a sympathetic little hum, the kind of sound people make about hospitals, and said, "Oh, that poor thing. Is she doing any better?" The young couple exchanged a look that said they'd heard the name, too. In 30 seconds, without one cruel word, the table built a fence around a woman who hadn't even arrived, and Caleb sat inside the fence with her empty chair and recognized the architecture exactly. He'd lived in that fence for 3 years. People didn't avoid you because they were unkind. They avoided you because grief embarrassed them, because they didn't know their lines, because you had become a walking reminder that the floor can open anywhere, anytime, under anyone. She came through the side gate at 7:15 carrying a covered dish, and Caleb's first thought, before any other, was that she walked like someone braced for weather. Margaret Holt was 41, brown hair gone early to a few threads of silver she clearly hadn't bothered to fight. A navy cardigan over a white shirt, a flower smudge on one cuff she didn't know about. Pretty in the way of a lit window in the evening, nothing flashy, just warm and a little out of reach. Her husband Sam had been the high school's baseball coach, beloved, loud, the kind of man whose funeral closes a town for an afternoon, and he had dropped dead of an aneurysm in his own driveway 2 years ago at 43. Caleb knew the story the way everyone knew it. He'd just never met the woman the story happened to. "I brought a peach cobbler," Maggie said, to the air slightly above everyone's heads, in the voice of a woman who had practiced this sentence in the car. "Sam's mother's recipe. So if it's bad, there's nothing any of us can do about it." A beat of silence. Nobody knew if they were allowed to laugh at a sentence with Sam in it. Caleb laughed. Just him, a real one, low and surprised. Maggie's eyes found him across the table, and something behind them flickered, like a pilot light catching. She took the chair across from him, and the table performed its welcome, voices a half step too bright, everyone suddenly fascinated by passing the olives. Patricia introduced Caleb as our miracle worker. He saved the whole front porch, and Maggie shook his hand across the candles, a good handshake, a working handshake, and said, "The craftsman on Linden Street?" "My husband used to slow the car down to watch your crew work. He said it was the only honest reality show in town." She heard herself say "my husband," and Caleb watched her brace, one beat, for the table's flinch, and the table flinched right on schedule, 6 gazes dropping to 6, and Maggie absorbed it the way you absorb a stare that isn't there, and reached for the bread. Caleb said, "Linden Street had knob and tube wiring and a raccoon with opinions. Tell Sam's ghost the show had a rough season. It came out before he'd cleared it with himself, and the table went rigid, and Maggie looked up at him, startled, and laughed. The first true sound at that table all evening, and said he would have loved the raccoon, and for a second the two of them were the only people there. The first hour went the way Caleb expected, which is to say the table talked around her. They were not cruel people, they were worse than cruel, they were careful. Conversations were steered into safe pastures, vacations, the orthodontist's new boat, whether the school district would pass the levy. And any sentence that drifted within a mile of husbands, hospitals, anniversaries, or the past 2 years got gently herded away while everyone glanced at Maggie to see if she'd noticed, which she always did, because the bereaved notice everything. Twice she started a story, Sam used to say, and twice the table flinched so visibly that she folded the story back up and put it away and reached for her wine instead. It was Doug who finally drove the truck into the wall, because there's always a Doug. They were between the salad and the brisket, the citronella candles throwing soft circles of light, and Caleb had just managed, twice, to quietly open small doors for her. When the table talked vacations, he asked Maggie where she'd go if gas were free, and she said Door County before she could stop herself. And then, testing the ice, Sam and I went every October, and Caleb said, "Which side, bay or lake?" instead of changing the subject, and watched her answer like a woman being handed back something confiscated. When Glenn struggled to name the contractor who'd built the Mercer's original garage, it was Maggie who knew, because Sam had coached the man's sons, and Caleb said, "Sounds like Sam knew everybody," and Sam was the town's group chat before phones, and for a moment the table almost relaxed into letting the dead man sit with them. Caleb could see them wanting to. He could also see the habit of 2 years holding them back, the careful glances, the conversational guardrails, and he understood that somebody was going to have to break something before anything could get fixed. He just expected it would be him doing the breaking, gently, with intent. Instead, it was Doug, with a backhoe. He leaned back with the lordly ease of a man who had never lost anything bigger than a fairway and said, "You know, Maggie, I've got to say, it's good to see you out. Sherry and I were just saying, it's been, 2 years now? At some point, you've got to get back on the horse. Sam wouldn't want you sitting around. Life's for the living, am I right?" He raised his glass at his own wisdom. Time heals. You just have to let it. The table went very still. Patricia's serving spoon paused mid-air, and Caleb watched Maggie do the thing that broke his heart in a single second. He watched her smile. The smile. The reflexive, "You're probably right" smile that grieving people learn to deploy so that comfortable people can stay comfortable. The smile that costs the wearer everything and the audience nothing. He knew that smile from the inside. He had worn it at hardware stores and Christmas dinners and his own brother's wedding. "Doug," Caleb said, before he'd decided to say anything. The table. Caleb kept his voice where he kept it for skittish clients and load-bearing walls, low and level. Grief doesn't keep office hours. You don't get to bill her for running long. Doug blinked. "I just meant I know what you meant. You meant it kindly, and it landed like a brick, and that's most of what people say to widows. Kindly thrown bricks." Caleb turned his glass slowly on the cloth. "My wife died 3 years ago. Anna, cancer, and I can tell you the horse Doug's talking about doesn't exist. There's no getting back on, there's just learning to carry it so the weight stops showing, and the better you carry it, the more people decide you're fine and the more alone you get." So, he looked across at Maggie, whose dutiful smile had fallen completely off her face, leaving something bare and stunned behind. "I'd like to hear about Sam if you want to tell it. I'm not afraid of him." For 3 full seconds, the only sound was the candles and a distant lawnmower finishing somebody's Saturday. Then, Maggie let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for 2 years. "He was so loud," she said, and laughed, wet-eyed, and the table, given permission at last, laughed with her, the relief of it almost physical. God, he was loud. You could hear him coaching third base from our kitchen 1/2 mile away. The neighbors knew our anniversary because he'd sing on the porch. And she was off, story after story spilling out of her like water through a breached dam, Sam losing a bet and dyeing his beard the school colors, Sam crying at the end of every single season, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones. Sam, who couldn't fix a single thing in the house and so had personally kept 3 local handymen in business, and Caleb watched a table full of careful people lean in and laugh and remember the man out loud, which it turned out was all anyone had been waiting 2 years for someone to make safe. Somewhere in there the plates got cleared and the cobbler came out, and Patricia, voice gentler than Caleb had ever heard it, asked, "Maggie, how are you, really? Nobody's asked you that in a long time, have they?" Maggie looked down at the cobbler, Sam's mother's recipe, steam rising off it into the cool air, and was quiet for a while. The last morning, she said finally, he left a note on the counter. He did it every day we were married, 16 years, just a dumb little note, gone to "You're stuck with me, love S." That morning's note said, "Bringing home pizza, don't make plans, you're my plans." Her thumb moved across the table's edge like she was reading it again. He never made it back up the driveway, and the thing nobody tells you is that the big stuff isn't what gets you. The funeral, the paperwork, you survive that, everyone's watching, you perform. What gets you is the Tuesday 3 months later when you cook for 2 out of 16 years of habit, and you stand there with a plate you have no one to hand to. She looked up and her eyes went around the table, landing nowhere in particular. You've all been so worried about saying the wrong thing to me that you stopped saying anything at all. I didn't lose just Sam. I lost everyone who didn't know how to talk to me anymore. That's the part I'd change, if I could. Not the avoiding, the silence, the candles burned, nobody reached for the cobbler. And then Caleb heard his own voice, low, saying the thing he had never said out loud at any table anywhere. "Anna used to sing harmony to commercials," he said. "Insurance jingles, cat food. Full harmony, dead serious, and after the funeral, people kept telling me she's still with you, and I'd nod, because that's the polite thing. But here's the truth. 6 months in, a dog food ad came on while I was making dinner. And the harmony part just didn't happen. The kitchen stayed quiet. And I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand and understood for the first time that still with you is something people say to comfort themselves. Not you." He turned his glass once on the cloth. "Maggie's right. You survived the funeral. It's the dog food commercial that takes you apart. And the worst of it is you can't tell anybody, because the one person who would have understood the dog food commercial is the reason you're standing alone in the kitchen." He looked up. "So no, Doug, there's no horse. There's just other people who know about the kitchen. And tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I'm sitting across from one." Sherry was crying first, openly, mascara surrendering. Then Patricia, who Caleb would have bet money had never cried at her own table in her life. Glenn pressed his napkin to his face and pretended it was his nose. The young couple held hands so hard their knuckles went white. Even Doug, brick-throwing Doug, sat there with his jaw working and his eyes shining, and finally said, "Horse, Maggie, I'm sorry. That horse stuff." "I'm an idiot," and Maggie reached over and patted his hand and said, "You are, Doug, but you're a sweet one." And the table laughed and cried at the same time, 8 people around a dish of peach cobbler, finally telling the truth. And across the candles, Maggie looked at Caleb, the man who had unlocked the door by simply not being afraid of what was behind it, and mouthed, "Thank you." And Caleb nodded once, because that was a complete sentence where he came from. The party broke up late and easy, hugs in the driveway, Doug gripping Caleb's hand a beat too long. Caleb was nearly to his truck when he heard the gate and turned, and Maggie was coming down the walk with her empty cobbler dish under one arm and the porch light catching the silver in her hair. "You knew," she said. "All night you knew exactly what every minute of that felt like. The careful voices, the herding. 3 years of it," Caleb said. "You start to recognize the choreography." "Anna," she said, trying the name. The commercial story was the truest thing anyone said at that table in years. "Tell me another one. One nobody's heard." Caleb leaned against the truck, the metal cold through his sweater, crickets going in the hedge. "She labeled my toolbox," he said. "Every drawer. Except she made the labels up. The socket drawer says round arguers, the level says truth stick. I've never fixed them. Apprentices think I'm insane." Maggie laughed, and the sound of it did something to the September air. "Nobody's asked me for a story in 3 years, Caleb said. They ask how I'm doing, never who she was. "I know," Maggie said. "God, I know." She looked at her car, then back at him, and Caleb watched her square up to something. "I'm going to say this part out loud, because I spent 16 years married to a man who taught me you should always say the good thing out loud while everyone's still in the driveway. I haven't felt like a person at a dinner table in 2 years, and tonight I did, and it was because you sat down across from me and weren't scared. I'd like to do this again, just us. Coffee or a walk, I don't care. I'm asking first, so you don't have to stand there wondering if it's allowed." She lifted her chin a little. "It's allowed." Caleb looked at this woman holding an empty dish under a porch light, asking him back into the world, and felt something in his chest shift on its foundation for the first time in 3 years. "I'd love that," he said. The coffee happened the following Saturday, at a diner called the Bluebird on the edge of town. Mismatched chairs, paper napkins, a hand-lettered sign by the register warning customers that the salsa was, quote, "not kidding." They'd both arrived 10 minutes early, which they discovered when they met in the parking lot, and both pretended they hadn't, and both knew the other was pretending. And that was somehow the perfect start. They took the corner booth by the window, morning sun coming through the glass and lighting up the steam off 2 heavy white mugs, and for the first half hour they did the careful thing. Jobs, the town, the Mercers, whether Doug had survived the drive home with Sherry, who according to Patricia had not stopped lecturing him until the second stoplight. Then Maggie wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "Okay, ground rules. I've been on exactly 2 of these since Sam died, both arranged by people who meant well, and both men spent the whole meal terrified, like I was a museum exhibit with an alarm, touch nothing, mention nothing, speak softly near the widow." She looked up at him. "I don't want a meal like that. If I mention Sam, you don't have to flinch. If you mention Anna, I won't flinch. Deal?" "Deal," Caleb said. Anna would have already sent the salsa back to test the sign. Maggie laughed, startled, delighted. Sam would have eaten it on a dare and cried in front of everyone and called it the best day of his life. And that was the gate swinging open. The eggs went cold while they traded their people back and forth across the table like photographs. The good stories first, then the harder ones. The hospital months for Caleb, the casseroles that filled Maggie's freezer that first month, and the silence that filled everything after, and at some point the waitress refilled their mugs for the 4th time and gave Caleb a look that said, "On the house, don't blow this." They were the last of the breakfast crowd and the first of the lunch crowd. When they finally surrendered the booth, Maggie stopped on the sidewalk, squinting in the noon light, and said, "Huh," Caleb asked, "What?" 3 hours, she said, showing him her watch. "I just talked about my dead husband for 3 hours and I feel lighter, not heavier. You're either very good company, Caleb Turner, or that diner is a portal." She narrowed her eyes. "Walk me to the hardware store and we'll gather more evidence." He did. It wasn't on her way home, and they both knew it, and he bought a box of wood screws he didn't need while she read every label in the paint aisle and asked him what color a kitchen should be, and he said, "Whatever color makes you cook in it again," and she went quiet in the way he was learning meant a direct hit. And then she bought a sample can of a warm yellow called Morning Hour, and that was how Thursday dinners began, because somebody had to help her decide if the color worked, and the only honest way to judge a kitchen is to cook in it. Coffee became a walk became Thursday dinners at her kitchen table, the warmest room Caleb had been in since his own, went quiet yellow lamp over the stove, Morning Hour on the walls. Radio low, the smell of whatever she was teaching him to cook badly. They had the strangest courtship in town and the most honest one. 2 people who could say the names. She'd say Sam would have liked you, he never trusted a man with soft hands, and Caleb would say Anna would have made fun of your radio station within 5 minutes, and instead of haunting the house, the dead pulled up chairs and blessed it. There were hard nights too, and they learned each other's. The first time Maggie went quiet mid-dinner and set down her fork, Caleb didn't ask what's wrong. He just said, "Anniversary?" And she nodded, the wedding one, and he cleared the plates and put on Sam's favorite terrible classic rock station, and they sat on the back step with the screen door creaking in the wind and didn't talk. And it was the most useful thing anyone had done for her in 2 years. Caleb fixed her gutters without being asked. Maggie noticed when he went quiet near Anna's birthday and didn't herd him away from it, just put a coffee in his hands and sat with him in it. The town noticed them, of course the way towns do, and the same people who had avoided Maggie for 2 years now stopped her at the grocery store glowing with approval. And she bore it with grace in public and did flawless impressions of them at the kitchen table after, and Caleb laughed harder in those months than he had in years. They moved slowly, 2 careful carriers of weight, learning they could set some of it down in the same room. The complication came in November, and it came through the front door with a key. Sam's younger sister, Dana, still grieving herself and patrolling her brother's memory like a guard dog, walked into Maggie's kitchen on a Thursday and found Caleb at the stove in an apron and Maggie laughing at the table, and the look on Dana's face turned the room to glass. 2 years, Dana said, voice shaking. He's barely cold and you've got a man cooking in his kitchen. Did you ever love my brother at all? Caleb set down the spoon and started to speak, and Maggie stood up and stopped him with one hand on his chest, not in front of her, beside her, and faced her sister-in-law alone because some doors you have to answer yourself. Sit down, Dana, she said quietly. I'm going to tell you about the Tuesday with the plate. And she did, all of it. The notes, the silence, the 2 years of being a town's awkward subject, while Dana cried into a dish towel, and at the end Maggie said, "Loving Caleb doesn't subtract 1 ounce from Sam. Grief isn't a budget. And your brother told me 100 times, you're my plans, Mags, and if it's ever just you, make new ones. So that's what I'm doing. I'd like you in them." Dana stayed for dinner. She had 2 helpings. In the spring, Caleb restored the old porch swing Sam had never gotten around to fixing, sanded it, reslung it, and the first evening it hung true, Maggie sat on it with her coffee and cried a little and laughed at herself for crying, and then made him sit on it too, to test the weight rating. And they stayed out there until the streetlights came on. The swing became theirs the way the diner booth was theirs and the yellow kitchen was theirs, a geography of small claimed places. Dana started coming to Thursday dinners. Doug, to everyone's astonishment, became their most devoted champion, telling the story of that dinner party all over town with himself cast accurately as the idiot, which Caleb privately thought was the bravest thing the man had ever done. And one June evening, with the yard smelling of cut grass, Caleb left an envelope on the swing seat. Inside was a note, because by then he'd learned the house's oldest custom, "Don't make plans, you're my plans, love C," and a ring taped beneath the words. Maggie found it, sat down hard on the swing, laughed and cried in the same breath the way she had at that long-ago table, and came inside saying yes before he'd even asked it properly. They were married in Patricia and Glenn's backyard under the same string lights, on the same patio almost 2 years to the week after that dinner, and Patricia wept through the whole ceremony with the unself-conscious abandon of a woman who had finally seen one of her seating charts achieve its destiny. There were 2 empty chairs in the front row with flowers on them, on purpose, and nobody at that wedding was careful, and everybody told the loud stories. Doug gave a toast that began, 2 years ago at this table, I said the dumbest thing of my life, and ended with the whole yard on its feet. Dana stood up with Maggie. Caleb's brother stood up with him and told the harmony story, and somewhere in the middle of it the caterer's radio in the kitchen window started playing a jingle, some insurance ad, and Maggie reached over without a word and took Caleb's hand, and he held on, and the kitchen wasn't quiet anymore, hadn't been for a long time. The cobbler was Sam's mother's recipe, and it was perfect, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Caleb had spent his whole life restoring things, and he finally understood the trade he was actually in. You don't fix what's broken by replacing it. You honor the original structure, and you build on. So let me ask you something. What would you have done at that table when Doug told a grieving widow it was time to get back on the horse? Would you have spoken up or studied your plate like everyone else? And have you ever lost someone and found that the silence of the people around you hurt worse than the loss itself? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story touched you tonight, leave a like, subscribe for more stories like this, and I'll see you in the next video.